Mother was in a coma. The doctor asked for the legal guardian. The girl replied coldly, "He's not family, just the second husband, and a poor black man." He didn't react. He simply stood still, then was asked to leave the emergency room. Minutes later, the treatment plan she signed off on triggered a vascular collapse. And the only person who knew her medical history, allergies, everything about his wife, was the man who had just been pushed out. Because he wasn't blood. One prejudice nearly cost a mother her life. One denial nearly tore an entire family apart. Stay until the end, because some men go their whole lives never being called dad. Yet they are the ones quietly holding a family together. 2 a.m. While the whole neighborhood was still fast asleep, Camille Thornton's phone rang, slicing through the silence of the night. On the screen flashed, St. Aurelia Medical Center, emergency call. She picked up, her voice still heavy with sleep. On the other end, an ICU nurse spoke quickly. "Your mother, Mrs. Margaret Thornton Hayes, has just been rushed into the ER. We need the legal next of kin to come immediately. Her condition is critical." Camille didn't have time to ask more. All she could hear in her mind was a single pounding plea, "Don't be too late." She dashed out of her apartment into the cold night air, carrying only her wallet, her phone, and a fear growing heavier in her chest. 9 minutes later, the ER's automatic doors slid open. Camille ran through the bright white hallway, heart pounding wildly. She didn't need directions. She'd known this place since she was a child, but what she didn't expect was the person who brought her mother to the hospital had been standing silently outside the ICU for a long time. Malcolm Hayes, her stepfather, still wore his technician coveralls, his jacket stained with elevator grease, his boots dusty, eyes darkened from lack of sleep. But his gaze had never left the glass doors of the emergency room. No one paid attention to him. No one called his name. Only he stood there quietly, like a shadow. Between the sterile hospital lights and the fragile line between life and death. Camille walked briskly toward the doctor. The moment she saw the name on his white coat, she spoke up. "I'm Camille Thornton, the biological daughter of Margaret Thornton Hayes. I'm ready to sign whatever paperwork is necessary." Dr. Elliot Shaw looked at her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We need the legal guardian's consent for emergency surgery. Her condition is deteriorating rapidly. We can't wait more than 30 minutes. Camille instinctively turned. Malcolm was still standing there, just a few steps away. The same familiar figure she had seen for the past 10 years. But now, his presence made her throat tighten. She clenched her hand slightly, then spoke coldly, loud enough for everyone to hear. "He's not family. He's just my mother's second husband. I'll be taking full responsibility for any medical decisions." Malcolm didn't move. No reaction, not a single word of protest. He simply lowered his head. As if he had heard those words 100 times before, but each time still cut just as deep. Dr. Shaw turned back to Camille and handed her the consent form. Camille picked up the pen, signing with a hand that trembled slightly. Behind her, a nurse glanced toward Malcolm and quietly said to a colleague, "That man, he's the one who brought the patient in. He raised the alarm, called 911, and rode in the ambulance with her." The other nurse shrugged. "Maybe he's family, in some unofficial way." The ICU doors closed. Camille was invited into the paperwork area, but Malcolm was asked to step outside. No name in the file, no legal standing, just a man who had just watched his wife fight for her life behind a pane of glass and had just been dismissed by her daughter as not family. Camille had finished signing all the documents. The doctor gave her a respectful nod before hurrying off carrying the folder of forms. And with it, the belief that this was the rightful next of kin. A nurse gently stepped toward Malcolm and tilted her head politely. "I'm sorry, sir. This area is currently restricted to immediate family only. Please wait in the main hallway, if you don't mind." Malcolm said nothing. He gave a quiet nod, then slowly turned away. Like a man all too used to not being allowed to stay. A security guard watched him walk off and murmured to the nurse, "He's the maintenance tech here, isn't he? I've seen him checking the old elevators every night." The nurse nodded faintly and returned to her duties. Meanwhile, Malcolm walked down the freezing corridor, the sterile white light shining down on his graying hair. With every step he took, no one called his name. No one checked on him. No one knew that this man was the reason Camille's mother was still alive. He sat down on a cold plastic bench in the waiting room. His tool bag rested beneath his feet. An old phone trembled quietly in his hands, but no calls came, and no one was waiting for him to answer. From the distant window, he could still make out the faint silhouette of his wife through the ICU's blurry curtain. He wasn't allowed to stand by her side. He wasn't permitted to sign his name. He held no title in the system, just the two words, "Not identified." And in the very place he had once helped build, he was now just an extra. A silent shadow beneath sterile lights. No one knew who he was, and no one cared to ask. Camille stepped away from the ICU, walking down the corridor to get a phone signal. Her boyfriend, Tristan, was calling. She picked up, her voice tired but tense. "I just got here. Mom's in surgery." The doctors said, "It's really bad." Tristan asked, "Is anyone there with you?" Camille glanced toward the distant waiting area, then turned away, her tone sharp. "Yes, him. Still sitting here, like he has some right to be." A pause. "He thinks just because he married my mom, he gets a say in everything. He's a maintenance guy, Tristan, an elevator grease monkey." She let out a bitter, dry laugh. "My mom was kind. She's always been that way. 10 years ago, she took pity on him. And now, he thinks he's family." Tristan said nothing. Camille lowered her voice, almost whispering to herself, "It's just, he doesn't belong in this life. Not with Mom, not with me, and definitely not in this hospital." What she didn't know was, just beyond the wall beside her, down a quiet corridor leading toward the utility wing, Malcolm Hayes was still sitting there, unmoving, unblinking, silent. But every word she had just spoken had reached him. Every single one, clearly. No one knew he was there, no one called him back, and he didn't rise. He simply sat in silence, his hand gripping the worn handle of his tool bag, his eyes no longer fixed on the ICU door, but on a distant place. The place where he once believed he belonged. Malcolm was still sitting there, in that cold, white corridor, amid the intercom announcing visiting hours and the hurried footsteps of passing doctors. He remained motionless, as if everything around him had stopped. He pulled out his phone. An old phone, its corner slightly cracked. No new messages, no missed calls. Only one photo saved in his favorites, an old picture. It showed her, Margaret Thornton, smiling brightly in the hospital garden. Her brown hair falling gently over her shoulders, a watering can in hand, saying something he could no longer remember. Only her eyes remained in his memory, soft, truly soft. He remembered the late afternoons, back when he was supervising the new ICU construction project. They met when she was a temporary administrative manager at the hospital. A woman who already had a child, had gone through divorce, had been hurt, and yet still lived with kindness. And he was the only black man in the design room, often mistaken for just a laborer, never lifted his head when others laughed behind his back, until the day Margaret brought him a cup of coffee and asked, "Do you need more sugar, or just someone familiar to share lunch with?" Malcolm smiled, that kind of smile, fleeting, like a breath. He remembered the time she fell ill with a fever. No family came. Camille was away at college, and her old relatives had long cut ties. Only he sat outside the ER all night, his eyes fixed on the heart monitor screen. It was the first time he realized he could die if he lost someone. Not because of duty, not because of status, but because of love. He looked again at his phone screen. His finger trembled slightly. Her photo was still there. Among all the things he had built, repaired, or lost, she was the only thing. He had never let go. Inside the ICU, the surgical lights flicked on. Lead physician, Dr. Elliot Shaw was speaking quickly with his medical team. "Patient," Margaret, 62 years old. History of hypertension. Currently undergoing acute ischemic stroke treatment. The initial protocol is thrombolytic therapy, as per the family's signed consent. A nurse stepped forward with an older file. Patient has a note on cardiovascular disease and conduction disorders. Dr. Shaw frowned. Wait, if she has a conduction disorder, then using alteplase now could trigger a cerebral hemorrhage. The room froze. A young doctor asked, "Should we adjust the protocol, doctor?" Dr. Shaw glanced at the clock. They were still within the golden window. But less than 40 minutes remained for effective intervention. "We don't have enough information, and the daughter, next of kin, has already signed off on Protocol A. No one else has the authority to override it." Outside, Camille sat quietly in her chair. She had no idea that her decision was guiding her mother down a dark, uncertain path. Malcolm hadn't returned to the main waiting room. He stood leaning against an old iron railing on the hospital's service level, the very place where he'd once repaired every elevator door connected to the ICU. Beneath his feet, his wife's life now hung in the balance between life and death. And he had no say in any of it. Back in the operating room, Dr. Shaw looked over the file once more. Something inside him stirred. He asked, "Who lives with the patient?" A nurse replied, "Unclear, but the one who brought her in was her husband." Dr. Shaw paused in thought, then shook his head. "And yet he has no legal authority." The clock on the wall kept ticking. With every second lost, another portion of Margaret's brain faced irreversible damage. If no one corrected the treatment plan in time, Margaret might never wake up again. Malcolm stood on the technical floor, eyes cast down toward the hospital courtyard. Cold wind tugged at his collar, but his head was burning. In his hands, he held Margaret's old medical file, a color photocopy of her entire treatment history. Every drug she'd ever taken, every adverse reaction that had nearly stolen her from him. He carried it in his bag every day. Not out of obligation, but out of fear. A year ago, in this very hospital, he'd been one step too late. A nurse administered the wrong diuretic. He noticed too late, and Margaret spent 3 days in the ICU. They survived that scare, but Malcolm never forgot. And now, Camille had signed, unaware that the drug they were about to use could send Margaret away forever. His heart pounded, his lips trembled, but his hands tightened. Not again, not this time. He turned around, striding quickly down the corridor, slipping through narrow maintenance passages he once repaired, and for the first time in many years, he wasn't acting as a technician, he was acting as a husband. Malcolm returned to the ICU hallway, walking fast, as if something inside him was on fire. He didn't wait for permission, didn't ask anyone to open a door. He simply walked straight to the coordination desk, where doctors were flipping through charts at a frantic pace. A nurse stepped in to stop him. "I'm sorry, this area is—" Malcolm raised his hand, not violently, but firmly. "I'm not here for recognition. I'm here because I know she won't survive if you follow that protocol." Dr. Elliot Shaw looked up. "And who are you?" Malcolm met his eyes that hadn't blinked in over 3 hours. "I'm her husband. I've lived with her for 10 years. I have every medication record, every treatment log, and a handwritten allergy chart she made back in 2020. He opened his worn shoulder bag, pulled out a stack of crumpled papers, carefully sealed in a clean Ziploc pouch. "She has a severe allergy to strong circulation stimulants. The last time she was given one, she almost died. And now, you're about to give her that exact drug again, just because one line was missing in your system." The entire room went silent. A young doctor flipped through Malcolm's documents, eyes widening. Dr. Shaw spoke low and steady. "I can't act on this information unless you have legal authority." Malcolm didn't shout, didn't plead. He simply spoke, softly, but with every word weighted like stone. If a piece of paper is the only thing that defines who counts as family, then maybe she would have been dead a long time ago. A long pause. No one said a word, until Dr. Shaw picked up the phone and quickly dialed an internal number. "Get the medical director." We need to verify the original records immediately. And while outside, Camille still believed she was the only one in control. Inside stood a man with no name in the system, yet he was the only one. Who knew what could actually save the woman he loved? No one in the hospital knew that Malcolm Hayes was once a well-known name in the biomedical engineering world. 10 years ago, he was head of infrastructure development at St. Aurelia. The man behind the smart elevator system, emergency power grid, and central oxygen supply in the ICU. He had sat in board meetings with the hospital's leadership, had been featured in engineering journals, and once held the authority to sign off on life-saving equipment proposals. Until one day, a devastating incident. An 8-year-old child got trapped in a hospital elevator while waiting for emergency surgery. Security footage revealed a programming error. The doors failed to open on the correct floor. 7 minutes were lost, and the child didn't survive. Malcolm hadn't been operating the system that day, but he was the one who had designed it, supervised it, and signed the final quality check. He didn't make excuses, didn't blame the software, didn't fault the contractors. He simply stayed silent and resigned from the engineering board right after the internal hearing. The press called it a dignified departure, but he knew it was the first time he heard himself hate who he was, so much that he couldn't bring himself to press an elevator button anymore. From that point on, he chose to live in the background. He reapplied to the very hospital he had once helped design, but only for the lowest level. Maintenance technician, the man who tightened screws, the one who greased the elevators. No title, no speeches, no more top floors. Margaret was the only one who never brought up that past. She didn't need him to be the man who once founded something. She just needed someone who made tea in the mornings, someone to steady her when she got dizzy, someone who knew exactly when to place a hand on her shoulder and say nothing. But today, the nightmare had returned. One wrong decision, one rushed protocol, and this time if he stayed silent again, the only person who ever called him husband might be gone forever. Inside the emergency room, Dr. Shaw glanced at the vital signs monitor. Margaret's heartbeat was dropping, minute by minute. "We have 22 minutes left to decide. If we don't change course, the patient could fall into permanent coma." A nurse's voice trembled. "Are we sure, doctor? This protocol, it doesn't seem to match the recorded medical history." Dr. Shaw pressed his fingers to his forehead. "I know, but I can't alter the records unless the legal guardian requests it." Meanwhile, in the hospital's lower level, Malcolm sat alone in a small maintenance room, his phone gently vibrating in his hand. He looked up at the wall clock, the ticking second hand slicing through time like a blade. 22 minutes. Then he opened his bag. Inside was Margaret's personal medical file, carefully wrapped in waterproof plastic, worn at the corners. He had kept it with him for 5 years, carrying it like a habit, or maybe a silent act of penance. He flipped to the first page. Her handwritten note was still clear. "If I lose consciousness, let Malcolm make the decisions for me." Malcolm gripped the page tightly, then reached for his phone. The screen lit up with a number he had sworn he would never call again. This cannot happen again. Not this time. He dialed. Ring. Once, twice, 3 times. "St. Aurelia Board of Directors office. How may I help you?" His voice came through, low, steady, unwavering. "This is Malcolm Hayes. I need emergency authority, immediately." The voice on the other end paused. "Mr. Hayes? Chairman of the Hayes Foundation, primary donor of the ICU wing, and I am requesting an immediate hold on all current procedures. I have personal medical documentation, and I will assume full legal liability for any risks." At that same moment inside the doctor's room, a soft alarm began to beep from the blood pressure monitor. Dr. Shaw turned to the screen. Margaret's blood pressure was dropping. "We no longer have 20 minutes, maybe only 10. Another doctor rushed in. "Call from the board. Malcolm Hayes is demanding a direct meeting with the hospital director." Dr. Shaw stood still for a moment. Down on the technical floor, Malcolm stood up. He left his tool bag beneath the bench. And for the first time in years, he stepped into the hallway, not as a technician, but as a man ready to do it all over again, to save the one woman who was slipping away from him, second by second. On the 5th floor, inside the hospital's executive boardroom, Dr. Nadine Blake, chief director of St. Aurelia, was mid-meeting with department heads, discussing the quarterly report. No one in the room noticed the message that had just popped up on her phone. Then an internal call rang through. Dr. Blake, apologies for the interruption. There's an urgent call from the board of directors, directly from Mr. Vernon Dale, executive secretary. She raised her hand, signaling to pause the meeting, and picked up the phone. On the other end, Vernon Dale's voice came low and urgent. He just called again. Who? Malcolm Hayes. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Dr. Blake sat up straight. That name, she had heard countless times in her early years as director. Chairman of the Hayes Foundation. The man who withdrew from the board 5 years ago after a major incident. And the same man who once held the authority to halt any ICU procedure if serious risk was identified. What does he want? She asked. He's requesting an emergency assembly. He's bringing personal medical documentation for a patient, Margaret Thornton Hayes. And he's invoking Clause 4.2 of the old donor agreement, the right to medically intervene in emergency cases authorized by the benefactor. Dr. Blake opened her laptop and searched the archived contract, scrolling through 12 pages of terms until she reached Clause 4.2, long forgotten. If a medical donor identifies a life-threatening procedural error, and if the legal next of kin does not respond in time, the hospital is legally obligated to halt all intervention until full record re-verification is completed. She rose from her chair without saying a word to anyone in the room, leaving behind only one command: stop everything and bring him to me now. Executive boardroom, 5th floor. An emergency session had just been activated through the hospital's internal system. The entire ICU protocol was temporarily frozen. This was an extraordinarily rare occurrence, but the man who caused it had just stepped out of the elevator. Malcolm Hayes stood before the glass doors. His technician's coveralls still bore old oil stains. Heavy boots echoed across the polished tile floor. A security guard instinctively moved to stop him, out of habit. But Chief Director Nadine Blake spoke first. Let him in. Malcolm stepped into the room. Silence fell instantly. No one dared ask, "Who are you?" Because many in the room had heard the name. They just never imagined that this was the man behind it. An elevator maintenance worker, hands scarred, carrying a worn leather bag. He walked to the conference table and placed 2 items on its surface. A donor agreement stamped with an official seal. Bearing the signature, Malcolm Hayes, founding chairman, Hayes Foundation. And a thick 3-inch stack of personal medical records. Handwritten notes, printed emails from past doctors, allergy charts, and yearly medication adjustments. He looked directly at the director. I'm not here to reclaim a title, not here to take back a role. I just want to do the one thing I once failed at. To protect someone before it's too late. Dr. Blake remained quiet. She knew there was no legitimate reason to deny his authority, and no excuse left to keep turning away. She nodded. I will order the previous protocol halted, and we will proceed with the course you've proposed. Malcolm bowed his head. No one in the room saw that his eyes were already red, not from reclaiming power, but because, this time, he hadn't been too late. Camille returned to the ICU wing after a long phone call with relatives. She believed everything was settled. She had signed, the doctors had accepted, and the surgery was proceeding as planned. But when she approached the nurses' station, she sensed something was off. The nurses were whispering. Some doctors were stepping away from the operating room, and at the end of the hallway, the executive conference room doors were open. She walked closer, curious, and froze. In the center of the large boardroom, under harsh white lights, stood Malcolm Hayes, upright and composed, still wearing his oil-stained technician uniform. But on the table in front of him lay the hospital's donor contract bearing his name and her mother's comprehensive personal treatment file. Dr. Shaw stepped out and saw Camille. He nodded. "You're just in time. I want to thank you for signing the initial consent. But that protocol has been stopped." Camille blinked in confusion. "Stopped? Why?" I'm the legal guardian. I approved the treatment." Dr. Shaw pointed toward Malcolm. "And he's the one who brought the data that saved your mother's life. That file, it's been tracked for 8 years. It includes records of near-fatal allergic reactions. There's nothing in our system that comes close to that level of detail." Camille turned toward Malcolm, unable to believe what she was seeing. "What?" Director Nadine Blake stepped forward. Her words were few, but each one landed like a weight. "Mr. Malcolm Hayes is the founder of the Hayes Foundation, the organization that funded the entire ICU wing your mother is now in. If not for him, we wouldn't have the facilities we have today. And without him, your mother would no longer be alive." Camille stood frozen. Everything she had believed, that he was just a lowly technician living off her mother's charity, that he didn't belong in her world, crumbled in a single moment. She suddenly felt small, standing amidst documents bearing his name, and all the cruel things she had once said now echoed back in her mind like blades, cutting in the opposite direction. 1 hour later, the light outside the operating room changed from red to yellow. Camille stood silently in the hallway, her hand tightly gripping her bag strap. No words, no texts. There was nothing left to say, after everything she had just heard and seen. Dr. Shaw stepped out. His lab coat was soaked with sweat. His face was tired, but his eyes were bright. "The surgery was a success. We changed the treatment plan just in time. If we had waited 10 more minutes, part of the brain could have gone necrotic." Camille said nothing. She gave a faint nod, but the weight in her chest didn't ease. Not at all. She looked to the side. Malcolm was sitting alone at the far end of the hallway, still holding that worn medical file, his eyes fixed on the post-op recovery room doors. No one was filming him. No one patted his back. No automated system said thank you. There was only him, the man who once walked away from leadership and returned not to take command, but to keep someone alive. Camille walked over, sitting down 1 seat away from him. Neither of them looked at the other. No one said a word. There was only silence. But this time, it wasn't the silence of distance, it was the silence of someone beginning to understand. Camille looked down at her own hands, the same hands that had signed a decision that nearly cost her mother's life, while the man she had dismissed as an outsider had kept every single life-saving page for years. On the other side of the door, Margaret lay still, breathing through a ventilator. But for the first time in many hours, Camille wasn't afraid of losing her. She was afraid that the one person most deserving to be called family was the one she had looked down on for far too long. Recovery room, a sterile white space, still and quiet. Only the soft rhythm of the monitor breaking the silence. Margaret lay motionless, her face pale, eyes still closed. Camille sat at the edge of the bed, gently holding her mother's hand. "Mom, it's me. I'm here." No response. A nurse checked the blood pressure one last time, then said softly, "If there are no complications, she should wake up in a few more minutes." Camille lowered her head. For the first time in her life, she didn't know what to say to make things right. She had always believed she understood her mother best. Always by her side, always right. And yet, she had nearly signed her mother's death warrant. A faint movement. Margaret's fingers twitched. Then her eyelids slowly began to open. The ceiling lights reflected in her clouded eyes. She blinked, then shifted slightly. Camille stood up, her eyes lighting up. "Mom, you're awake. It's me, Camille." But Margaret didn't look at her right away. Her eyes scanned the room, brows gently furrowed, as if searching for something. Something only she knew mattered above all else. Then her voice, weak but unmistakably clear, whispered out, "Malcolm, are you here?" Camille froze. That sentence, soft as breath, hit her heart like a bell ringing through her core. Not her name, not my daughter. but the name of the man she had once pushed out of the hallway, the one she deemed unworthy to stay. Outside the glass-paneled door, Malcolm was still standing. He didn't step inside. He simply smiled quietly when he heard her voice. He didn't need applause, didn't need recognition. He only needed one thing: that when she woke up, she still called his name first. 2 days later, morning sunlight filtered gently through the hospital room window. Margaret was past the critical phase, slowly recovering. Camille sat beside her, feeding her porridge. Her eyes no longer carried their old stubbornness. Her hands were clumsy in care, but her gaze had learned to listen. Margaret smiled softly. "My daughter's all grown up." Camille paused, then asked quietly, "Mom, did you ever blame me for not trusting him?" Margaret didn't answer right away. She simply looked out toward the hallway, where he was still sitting, like every day, his sleeve stained with paint, a quiet cup of coffee in hand. "No, sweetheart, because your father never blamed you either." That afternoon, Camille stepped into the hallway. Malcolm was drying his hands with a small cloth, getting ready to head home after a maintenance round. She approached, stood silently for a moment, then spoke, not looking him in the eye. "You don't have to forgive me, but I'd like to call you family." Malcolm turned to her. There was no surprise on his face, no pride, only gentleness. As if he had always been waiting for those words without demanding them. A father doesn't need to be called, he just needs to be allowed to stay. The following week, when the hospital held its appreciation ceremony for silent benefactors, Malcolm Hayes' name was never read aloud. No photo was hung in the Hall of Honor. No formal speech was given, but one person quietly changed that. Camille rewrote her mother's medical file and submitted an updated version to the hospital. In the field labeled Authorized Guardian, she wrote in her own handwriting, "Malcolm Hayes, the man whose name isn't on my birth certificate, but who was never absent when I needed him. Not everyone who brings you into this world will be the one who stays with you until the very end. There are people whose names aren't on any document, who aren't invited to family meetings, who are never called legal next of kin. But they're still there, quietly remembering every medication, noting every unusual symptom, and carrying, for years, a folder no one else ever cared about, except them." Malcolm Hayes never asked to be thanked. He only wanted to stay in that hallway, waiting for the moment someone he loved would wake up and call his name just once. If you've ever known someone like that in your life, a father, a mother, someone in the background who never asked for anything, leave a comment below. I'm grateful for them. And if you believe that, family isn't defined by blood, but by presence, sacrifice, and loyalty in the moments no one else is watching. Share this video and subscribe to Black Rise Dash so you don't miss the stories the world forgot to tell. Thank you for staying until the end.